Darkness has a memory, and tonight it remembers a king who was forced to kneel. From which country are you watching this video? Subscribe to this channel if you love Islam. Before deserts were mapped and oceans were named, there were realms beside ours where footsteps left no prints, and voices traveled on currents you could not touch. Those were the kingdoms of the Jinn, swift as sparks, subtle as wind, created from smokeless fire, living in valleys between our moments and thresholds between our breaths. Some were gentle, some were wild, and some crowned themselves with pride so heavy it bent their thrones. They built citadels inside storms and palaces inside silence. They watched us without being seen, racing across the skin of the world while men slept and cities forgot to lock their doors. In those days, rumor was a river, and rumor said that a human king had been given a command that reached into their hidden courts. When that rumor reached the halls of the Jinn King, he laughed first, for pride always laughs before it learns. He had generals who rode on lightning, and scouts who could read footnotes in the shadows. He had jurists who judged by riddles and poets who set traps with rhymes. He had everything except the one thing that keeps a crown from burning the skull beneath it: humility. Night after night he counted his armies like a miser counts coins, whispering, "Who can stand against us?" And the echo told him what he wanted to hear. But echoes are loyal only to the mouth that makes them. Beyond his banners and beyond his pride, the world kept turning under the will of the one who needs no armies. The Jinn King knew the histories of rebellions and treaties written in invisible ink, but he did not know how quickly a decree from Allah can cross the bridges the unseen have built for centuries. He did not know that power can be a locked door that opens inward, trapping those who push too hard. Messengers returned to him with tidings more unsettling than threats, a human prophet whose authority did not roar but simply was. A dominion that did not strut but stood like a mountain stands. A sovereignty that smelled not of smoke and iron, but of obedience. In the markets of the unseen, merchants stopped haggling when they spoke his name. In the schools where Jinn scholars debated on shelves of air, the arguments paused at the mention of his justice. Birds altered their flight patterns over his city. Ants reorganized their roads around his camp. The wind itself seemed to schedule its journeys by his calendar. That was the first crack in the Jinn King's laughter, a small fracture that let the truth seep in. He lifted his hand to silence the songs of victory and heard, beneath the din, the gentle tread of inevitability. He remembered stories older than his reign, how pride is a mirror that breaks the face staring into it. He remembered the first command given to creation and who refused it. A chill passed through halls that never knew winter. 0, 5, courtiers shifted, blades hummed in their sheaths, and somewhere a door that had never been closed drew itself quietly shut. The Jinn King stood, the weight of a crown suddenly real, and understood that a conversation was coming for him, and no army in his world could intercept it. He sent scouts not to measure the strength of an enemy, but to measure the depth of a mercy he did not yet understand. For the first time in his reign, he prepared not for war, but for truth. And truth does not negotiate. He was called Sulaiman, son of Dawood, prophet and king, and his rise was not the ascent of a man climbing a ladder of ambition, but the elevation of a servant raised by the hand of the Most High. Allah taught him what others could not learn by study, the speech of birds whose counsels meet on branches, and the patterns of ants whose caravans pass beneath the feet of kings. Knowledge flowed to him like clear water, and with it came the calm of authority rooted in gratitude, not greed. He did not chase the wind obeyed by the permission of Allah, bearing his command across distances that make maps blush. He did not bargain with the sea. Divers among the Jinn brought treasures from its ribs, and builders raised structures that turned sunlight into corridors. His court was a grammar of creation. Men and jinn and beasts and birds, arranged in sentences of order, each a word placed where it was meant to be. Justice sat beside him not as a guest but as a relative, and mercy walked the corridors like a familiar who knew every door. When he listened, the world answered. When he spoke, the world remembered the one who gave him the right to speak. There were days when his banners did not move, and yet victory came, because victory is not a flag but a fulfillment of truth. There were nights when his lamps were few, and yet the path was bright, because guidance is not oil, but obedience. The jinn who had once bragged of distance found themselves brought near, not by chains of iron, but by cords of decree. The rebellious among them felt the sting of discipline. The honest among them felt the ease of being rightly led. And Sulaiman did not mistake the procession for proof of his own greatness. He knew what every real leader knows, that a crown is only a shadow cast by a command that belongs to Allah alone. So when delegations came, some proud, some trembling, he did not meet them with the appetite of conquest, but with the appetite of guidance. He weighed power on scales that thieves cannot tilt. He corrected without cruelty and forgave without forgetting. Under his rule, order felt like rain on a thirsty noon, soft, inevitable, and exactly in measure. The people learned that authority can be a shelter when it kneels to the one who gave it, and the jinn learned that speed is no escape from a justice that moves at the speed of command. He taught through decisions more than declarations. When a creature of the air spoke, he listened. When a creature of the earth warned, he heeded. Gratitude was not his mood, it was his method. He counted blessings the way accountants count coins, with accuracy and with fear of loss, and so the treasure increased. His enemies found themselves disarmed not only by might but by meaning. For how do you fight a man whose victories are prostrations and whose banners are verses? The day came when the rumor of him became the road to him. The Jinn king, once loud in his chambers, arrived at a threshold where silence sounded like wisdom. And Sulaiman waited, not impatiently, for even time obeys when truth is about to speak. He would receive this unseen king as he had received all gifts, without vanity and without fear, knowing that honor is safest when it sits on knees that know how to bow. For dominion without remembrance is a drought, but dominion that remembers becomes a river, and wherever a river flows, even fire-born beings come to drink. He was the king who humbled giants not by shouting them into silence, but by measuring himself against the command of Allah and finding no room for pride. When a boast rose like smoke, he let the wind of remembrance push it away. When power surged like a river in flood, he guided it back within the banks of justice. Around him stood beings who could cross horizons between blinks, lift stones that made mountains jealous, and weave illusions thick enough to fool a marching army, yet they found themselves pausing at a single raised hand, because that hand moved only with permission. The strong among the jinn had learned to terrify the reckless and to tease the curious, but under Sulaiman they learned something harder than fear and rarer than awe. They learned limits. He taught limits the way a gardener teaches vines, not by snapping them in anger, but by training them toward fruit. A day began with the usual thunder of capability, offers shouted in 100 tongues, impossibilities volunteered by creatures who believed nothing could resist their speed, and Sulaiman listened, weighing each promise against truth as a goldsmith weighs a coin against its ring. One jinn swore he could uproot a fortress and set it in a valley before the sun turned in the sky, and Sulaiman asked not for spectacle but for purpose, not for noise but for benefit. He would say, "What good will it bring to people who plant and pray, to widows who count their dates, to orphans who sleep better when walls hold firm, and the Jinn would feel the heat of a question their pride had not prepared for. Glory without service deflated like a drum with a pinhole. The giants were humbled, not because their arms were tied, but because their claims were untied and shown to be string. And Sulaiman's court learned the grammar of usefulness, that every power is a sentence, and every sentence must end with worship. He did not compete with them on speed. He set the pace with wisdom. He did not outshout them. He outweighted their impulses, and when their excitement fell quiet, they heard the steady rhyme of justice telling them where to stand. When an arrogant spirit tried to dazzle the court with fire folded into shapes, Sulaiman pointed to a hungry mouth at the palace gate and said, "If your fire warms no hands and cooks no bread, then it is only a trick that leaves the world as it found it." The trick collapsed because reality has no need for applause. Another Jinn boasted of a journey beyond the atlas of stars, and Sulaiman answered, "The furthest map is meaningless if your heart has not traveled from vanity to gratitude." The boasting fell like a banner in a windless field. What did the giants discover? That humility is heavier than stone, and yet easier to carry. That obedience travels farther than wings. That a command given in the name of Allah softens the hardest while the way dawn softens night. The court recorded no tally of humiliations, because humiliation was not the method. Sulaiman's method was alignment, to set each being in the line where it belongs so the world could pray together without tripping over itself. When a dispute rose between a craftsman who shaped glass and a diver who returned with pearls, Sulaiman resolved it not by favoring spectacle, but by asking who serves the most with the least waste. The diver learned to return with gratitude. The craftsman learned to shape with patience, and both left wiser than they arrived. The giants were humbled by the quiet arithmetic of fairness. They learned that effort without intention is noise, and intention without obedience is a mirage. They learned that mercy is not softness but structure, the backbone that keeps strength from wandering. Those who once prowled the edges of human fear now patrolled the edges of human safety, standing where harm might gather and dispersing it like shepherds disperse wolves. The proud learned to be useful, and the useful learned to be grateful, and gratitude gathered over the kingdom the way rain gathers over a field ready to green. Sulaiman reminded them that the crown on a head is still below the throne above the heavens, and a murmur of assent traveled the ranks like a breeze through palm leaves, cooling tempers that had never been cooled, rinsing eyes that had only ever stared forward. He humbled giants by teaching them to measure themselves not against smaller beings, but against larger duties. He humbled them by proving that a miracle is only a signpost, and that the destination is worship. He humbled them by refusing to confuse fear with order, and by showing that the safest hands are the hands that rise in prayer before they ever point or close into a fist. Under him, speed discovered patience, force discovered purpose, and brilliance discovered boundaries, and none of these discoveries felt like defeat. They felt like home. Yet far from the measured calm of that court, deep in a citadel built from stormlight and stubbornness, a king of the unseen paced a hall that refused to echo his footsteps. He had measured his life by victories, and his victories by volume, and the silence that now wrapped itself around him felt like an uninvited counselor. Reports lay open on a table carved from petrified wind, each line another confirmation of Sulaiman's authority and another question about his own. He had never doubted the sharpness of his blades or the swiftness of his envoys, but he began to doubt the direction in which they moved. Pride argued that retreat is a rumor invented by the weak, while wisdom whispered that a pause can be a bridge the strong are brave enough to cross. His dilemma wore two faces, both demanding tribute. One face promised the sweetness of stubbornness, and the story of a lone sovereign who would not bend. The other face promised the quiet bread of safety for his people, and the story of a leader who knew the difference between a crown and a collar. He called his council, not to be told what he wanted to hear, but to test whether hearing had survived in a palace used to applause. The generals spoke first, their words armored by habit. They offered strategies of smoke and surprise. They plotted to break the lines between Sulaiman's permission and Sulaiman's reach, as if permission were a fence and not the horizon. The scholars spoke next, some with humility and some with nervously polished pride, recounting old compacts and older precedents, reaching for clauses that might excuse them from obedience while still claiming safety under Allah's sky. The poets murmured about honor, their lines braided from the hair of vanity and courage so tightly that even they could not tell which strand was which. The king listened until the room had made its last noise. He asked only one question, a small key he turned inside the locks of their claims. If we win by refusing truth, what have we actually won? The room did not answer because the room had never been forced to separate victory from verification. A courier arrived breathless and kneeling, bringing word that the wind itself had ferried Sulaiman's directives to places where even bold Jinn tread softly. The king felt a weight behind his sternum like a gate closing, but with it came the relief gates bring, the sense that perhaps chaos will not enter tonight. He dismissed the hall and walked a corridor lined with trophies that suddenly looked like questions, each one asking whether it had been necessary. He remembered the first command given to creation and the one who refused it, and he tasted the bitterness that follows disobedience, like a shadow follows a flame. In the private chamber where only truth had permission to sit, he unfolded a dilemma he had never practiced aloud. If he resisted, he would feed his pride and starve his people. If he submitted, he would feed his people and starve his pride. Which hunger was he willing to live with? He thought of the young among his kind, quick as arrows and just as easily lost, and of the old among them, tired of turbulence yet too proud to admit it, and he saw a nation balanced on the thin edge of his choice. He remembered nights when he could not sleep, because victory roared too loudly in his ears to let wisdom speak, and he wondered if tonight could be different. He stepped onto a balcony that looked over the city he ruled and the city that ruled him back, roofs like scales on a living creature, alleys like veins, towers like raised fingers asking for answers. The sky was a dark page written with silent stars, and he read in their stillness a sentence he had never wanted to sound out, that power without obedience is a storm with no rain. Below, he watched a mother of his people lead a child across a bridge that was more mist than stone, the child tugging free, the mother steadying, and he recognized in that simple scene the shape of leadership he had avoided. Leadership as restraint, leadership as redirection, leadership as humility stubborn enough to save. Pride tried to speak again, louder, promising that bending once means bending forever, but another voice rose, the one he barely remembered from his own earliest lessons, promising that bending to truth is the only way to stand upright before Allah. He understood then that this was not a political puzzle, but an act of worship disguised as a decision. He returned to his table and sent for 3 advisors whose records were clean of flattery. The first told him what safety would cost, and what disobedience had already begun to charge with interest. The second told him where his people were most vulnerable, the places where pride would be paid for by those who had never ordered it. The third told him a short story that fit into a single breath. A king once asked whether thunder obeyed him, and the rain answered first. The king dismissed them and felt a door open where earlier he had felt one close. He drafted a message that did not grovel and did not pretend, a message that stood like a man stands in prayer, straight yet softened by humility. He would go, not as a rival, not as a victim, but as a ruler who had learned that safety under justice is greater than sovereignty under sin. He rehearsed the words he might speak should he be allowed to speak at all, words that admitted limits without surrendering dignity, words that placed the welfare of his people above the furniture of his pride. In the courtyard, the horses of wind pawed the air, and the banners of heat curled around their poles as if trying to slip free of their duty. But even the restless felt a new discipline enter the night. He ordered his guard to carry no weapon meant to wound, only the weapon meant to remind, the remembrance that shields the heart against rebellion. He ordered his scribes to record not the length of the procession, but the weight of the intention. He removed a ring that had always meant authority to him, and found, to his surprise, that his hand felt lighter, and his reach felt truer without it. He stood before a mirror that had known only admiration, and asked it one last mercy: "Show me the cost of my stubbornness." The mirror showed him streets empty of laughter and a sky too tired to rain, and he turned away with a resolve that felt like waking. Pride made one final offer, a bribe wrapped in memory. "Remember the day you chased a storm to its source and wore it like a cloak?" And he answered, "I remember the day I learned that cloaks cannot stop arrows, only truth can." He summoned his heir and spoke softly, not of glory but of responsibility, telling him that a crown is a question that renews itself every morning, and that the only acceptable answer is service. He instructed his captains to keep watch not for ambush but for arrogance, for it is arrogance that always strikes first and retreats last. Dawn began to color the horizon with the pale courage of beginnings, and the king felt a steadiness he had mistaken his whole life for weakness. He stepped toward the road that would lead him into the presence of a prophet of Allah, and with each step he shed an ornament that had never protected him. His people watched and felt fear loosen its grip, because nothing calms a nation like a ruler who chooses obedience over theater. He did not yet kneel, because kneeling was not a performance to be scheduled, but a surrender to be earned by intention. He did not yet beg, because begging would be empty if it did not carry the full weight of choice. He did not yet speak, because sometimes silence is the most honest prologue to truth. He only walked, and with every pace the dilemma that had torn him slowly stitched itself into a single path. A path that would take him from the hall that adored him to the court that would correct him, from the pride that blinded him to the mercy that would allow him to see, from a throne balanced on wind to a ground firm enough to kneel on without falling. He did not come with banners but with breath held tight against his ribs, and every step toward the court felt like the truth pulling a knot loose. He had rehearsed 100 versions of defiance and found them all brittle, each one snapping in his hands before it reached his lips. He ordered his captains to remain behind, their hands empty of the old theater, and walked with only a handful of witnesses who understood that what would happen next could save a nation or scatter it. The gates did not creak as he passed, as if even metal preferred not to interrupt a heart approaching its verdict. Inside, the arrangement of the world seemed to have learned a discipline he had never studied men, whose faces carried the calm of duty, birds perched like scribes on the high beams, the wind crossing the hall as if it had an appointment. He felt eyes upon him that did not accuse but did not excuse either, a gaze that measured without humiliating, and somewhere beneath that gaze his own breath decided to slow down. He raised his head and saw him Sulaiman, son of Dawood, seated in the dignity of a servant who knows where majesty truly sits. There was no gaudy aura, no parade of thunder, only the serenity of obedience holding the center like a tent pole that does not sway, no matter how the desert argues with the sky. The king of the Jinn felt the last noisy piece of himself fall quiet. He bowed, not to a man as a man, but to the prophethood the man carried, and the bow did not bruise him as he had feared. It relieved him with the relief of putting down a weight he had never admitted was heavy. "Peace be upon you, Prophet of Allah," he said, each word a step away from an old cliff. "And upon you be peace," came the reply, a sentence that did not rush and yet arrived before anxiety could gather its courage. He asked permission to speak fully, without riddles and without the tightrope tricks his court had applauded for years, and permission was given with a slight nod that carried more stability than 1,000 loud assurances. He began to tell the story he had never allowed to escape his mouth. He admitted the arithmetic of his pride, how he had counted victories that did not bless his people, and how he had worn a crown that demanded constant noise to feel real. He spoke of the reports that had frightened him not because they threatened loss, but because they promised clarity. "We are beings of speed," he said, "and speed is easily confused with wisdom." He confessed that he had trained his nation to be impressed by what was quick instead of what was correct, by what dazzled instead of what served, and that under such training, even the faithful grew impatient with the slow mercy that changes things properly. He did not ask for the permission to remain as he was. He asked for the permission to become what he should have been. He said, "I come not to argue for my throne, but to argue for my people's safety, and the safety of a king is a poor substitute for the safety of a nation." Silence attended him like a patient teacher. When he finished his first breath of truth, he waited for judgment and found instruction instead. Sulaiman asked him questions that did not wound but did not wander either. "What do you call victory when it does not return home with justice? Where do you store your honor when the poor cannot find it? How do you salute your army when it is marching away from obedience?" The king felt each question settle into an old, empty room inside him, rooms his pride had kept locked, rooms mercy now furnished with clarity. He did not debate. Debate would have been a shield to hide behind. He did the harder thing. He agreed. An agreement with truth tasted like water after running too long across sand. He said, "I have come to place my strength where it belongs, under command." He said, "I have come to ask you to accept our service by the permission of Allah, that we may be protected from the worst stories we are capable of writing when left alone." And in that moment, the hall itself seemed to exhale, as if architecture could recognize repentance. The courtiers who had feared humiliation watched humility perform a subtler miracle. It kept dignity alive while removing arrogance like a thorn that had been poisoning the whole limb. Sulaiman signaled for water, and a cup was brought that looked like nothing special, and that was its lesson. The king drank, realizing he was learning from a cup what no counsel had managed to teach: the value of the plain thing that arrives exactly when needed. Then the prophet spoke with the steady courtesy of one who knows every soul is already being observed by the one who needs no witnesses. "Power is a trust," he said, "and trusts are kept only by those who are grateful. You will serve by Allah's permission, and your service will be counted as honor if it guards the weak, restores what was taken, and builds what will outlast your names." The king nodded and felt the nod reach bone deep. "And we will be held to account," Sulaiman added, "for oppression, for slipping into misguidance, for stirring fear where fear is not owed, for trading in whispers that darken the hearts of men." Quote. The king said what he had never said in a room full of listening ears: "I accept being held." He understood that a fence around a garden is not an insult to the fruit. With that, the first encounter sealed itself not with a performative oath, but with the simple alignment of two realities: authority that bows to Allah and strength that bows to authority. The court moved again, but it moved differently now, as if everything had found its lane. The Jinn king felt relief rise in him like dawn, that doesn't need permission to lighten the horizon. He had thought surrender would be a kind of dimming. It turned out to be the switch that allowed light to choose where to fall. Then the plea came. the one that would echo in rooms where his name was never spoken and in hearts that would never learn his lineage, the begging that did not sell dignity to buy safety but traded pride to purchase truth. He did not kneel to a man, as if a man could cancel the decrees written above the sky. He knelt toward the mercy of Allah and asked that Sulaiman bear witness. "I have wealth I cannot spend, and speed I cannot slow," he said, "and neither of these has taught me how to protect my people from their own fire. So I beg," he continued, the word begging fitting into his mouth with the shock of a key that had always been cut for his lock, "not for more land or longer life, not for illusions that impress today and embarrass tomorrow, but for mercy. I beg," and here the hall stilled as if sound itself wanted to listen, "for the kind of mercy that teaches obedience before punishment teaches fear." Quote, he asked that chains be put not on wrists but on impulses, that guards be stationed not at borders but at thresholds of intention, that his nation be drafted into service where service shapes the soul rather than spectacles that only sharpen vanity. He said, "Bind us to tasks that bless creation. Send our strongest to build, our swiftest to fetch what benefits, our cleverest to unfasten knots that have trapped families in hunger and communities in confusion." He admitted that under his watch, some had toyed with shadows to frighten the simple, and had made bargains with human folly to profit in the margins where ignorance lives. He asked that those markets be closed and those debts be paid by service. He confessed that he feared not the firmness of Sulaiman's command, but the looseness of his own if he were allowed to return unchanged. "Let there be rules," he said, "that cut like clean knives but heal like clean stitches. Let there be councils where the young among us learn to love truth before they love their tricks. Let there be audits of our invisible dealings, and let the penalty for deceit be labor that mends what deceit has torn. Let the smugness we have mistaken for safety be dismantled like a scaffold once the building stands." He asked not to be spared consequences, but to be given consequences that educated. He asked not for a loophole, but for a law, because loopholes breed mice, and laws build doors. He said, "Teach us to fear Allah more than we fear humiliation. Teach us to be ashamed only of disobedience, not of obedience that others misunderstand. And if I falter," and here his voice thinned but did not break, "let me be corrected quickly before my error blossoms into theirs." The plea haunted the listeners not because it was pathetic, but because it was accurate, a mirror held at the right distance. Every heart in that court, whether made of clay or fire, could see its own thin places where pride masqueraded as protection. Sulaiman watched without haste, then spoke with the balance that turns power into shelter. "Your begging," he said, "will not be for me to answer, but for Allah. Yet I can set the path along which mercy meets you." He laid out terms that were neither harsh nor negotiable. No deception of those who do not see you unless you are protecting them from harm. No commerce in fear. No recruiting the foolish into worse folly. If you take, you return double. If you frighten, you comfort. If you mislead, you guide until the misled finds the doorway again. He commanded that their speed be tithed to service days for building irrigation where the earth thirsted, nights for mapping safe roads for travelers, seasons for strengthening walls where widows slept alone. He appointed overseers from among the just of their kind, not informers obsessed with catching faults, but shepherds obsessed with keeping flocks whole. He required a council to meet by a rhythm that matched the moon, to report honestly, to confess promptly, to ask for assignments that stretch the muscle of obedience. There will be punishment, he said, for stubborn harm. But there will be more work than whips, because work is the medicine pride resists the most and needs the most. The king listened as if drinking, and did not wipe his mouth between sips, because thirst had manners he had forgotten. He said, "We accept." And acceptance rang in his voice with the clean sound of metal cooled properly after the fire. He asked for one more mercy, the kind that feels small and proves enormous. "When my people forget," he said, "as people do made of speed and ash and suddenly sure of themselves, send us reminders that don't only shock us, send us reminders that teach us. A sign here, a delay there, a door that won't open until we knock with a humble hand. Let us read our warnings early, so we don't have to learn them late." Sulaiman smiled as one smiles at a student who has finally asked the right question and said, "Reminders are written into the fabric of days. Your duty is to notice." He lifted his hands, not the gesture of a king claiming more, but of a servant returning everything, and asked Allah to make this covenant a rope that pulls toward good, and not a chain that merely restrains. The wind bore that prayer to corners where it would be repeated by others, translated into the languages of ants and birds, and the quiet talk of stones that have seen too many arrogant feet. The Jinn king lowered his forehead to the floor, and when he raised it, his eyes had the brightness that arrives after long rain. He turned to his witnesses and spoke the new grammar of his reign. "We will be measured by the good we leave behind, not the noise we make arriving. We will be praised, if we are praised at all, for the restfulness others feel when we pass. And if any among us refuse this path, they will be brought to it or brought away from us, for belonging will mean something again." He asked to begin at once, not because he trusted his momentum, but because he distrusted delay. Sulaiman assigned their first labors, as a doctor writes a prescription specific, proportionate, aimed not only at symptoms, but at the hidden illness. They were sent to rebuild a village roof by roof after a storm nobody had thought to blame on themselves. They were sent to mend a road where merchants had been losing small coins that later cost them large, to strengthen a well whose brackish water had taught children to accept bitterness as normal. He sent them to sit invisibly in courtrooms and make truth easier to hear, to whisper steadiness into hearts that already wanted to be fair. He sent them to stand unseen beside scholars who stayed up late, so that those scholars' fatigue would not turn precision into carelessness. "Serve where the world remembers you only as ease," he said, and they went. The king found himself lighter with every order he relayed, not because he had become less, but because he had become aligned. And the plea he had spoken remained in the air like a fragrance you catch hours after the flower has been moved elsewhere. The haunting of it was not dread, but devotion, a line that kept replaying in the mind. "Teach us to fear Allah more than we fear chains," because that line contained within it the cure for 1,000 tyrannies, large and small. Days later, when he walked among his people, he saw something he had not seen since his earliest, cleanest victories relief that did not require spectacle to maintain itself. Young ones who had learned to flash their gifts like weapons now used them like tools. Older ones who had hoarded influence began to spend it like alms. The markets of fear lost customers. The alleys of arrogance grew quieter. And the king recognized that mercy had answered his begging by giving him work, the kind of work that keeps a nation safe because it keeps a ruler small in his own eyes and large only in his responsibilities. He returned often to the court not to renegotiate but to renew intention, and every time he bowed the act felt less like falling and more like standing in the correct posture for a story that had finally remembered its author. Sulaiman listened until every restless note in the hall had settled, and then his words came like rain assigned to the exact field that needed it, not a drop wasted, not a furrow ignored. He did not speak to impress the Jinn king with a new form of power, because power competing with power only fattens pride and starves wisdom. He spoke to align the heart that commands with the Lord who commands hearts. "You were created, like mankind, for worship," he said. And the sentence did not arrive as a scolding, but as a doorway, wide and lit from within. Worship is not an interruption to your strength. It is the reason your strength was issued. He reminded them that obedience is not a leash, but a direction, not a lowering, but a lifting, because nothing stands taller than a creation that knows where to face. He told the king that fear of punishment can stop a hand, but love of Allah is what steadies it forever, and a kingdom steadied by love survives winds that topple empires balanced only by dread. He named the disease that pride hides behind many costumes, sometimes swaggering like arrogance, sometimes whispering like cleverness, sometimes pretending to be bravery while refusing to bow. Then he named the cure, gratitude, that moves like a pulse through every decision until decisions themselves become worship. Be grateful, he said, and your craft will become charity. Your speed will become service. Your stealth will become protection. Your knowledge will become safety for those who trust you. He did not flatter the king with the comfort of vagueness. He offered the mercy of clarity. There will be covenant, he said, and the word did not sound like a cage. It sounded like a bridge that even storms respect. You will be held to account for harm and honored for help. You will answer for whispers that turn families against each other and be rewarded for counsels that reconcile them. You will be questioned about tricks that profit from ignorance and praised for teaching that empties the market of deceit. He set a scale before them that vanity cannot tilt, the scale of benefit measured by the Lord who needs no witnesses to weigh. He spoke of intention as the hinge upon which deeds swing toward light or toward smoke, and he taught that a small service done sincerely outweighs a spectacle done for applause fades and sincerity echoes where eyes do not reach. He reminded them of the ant that organized a nation with a single warning, and of the bird that carried news more valuable than jewels, and he showed how creatures small in size become giants in obedience, while beings vast in ability become light as dust when they forget who raised the sky. He did not turn the Jinn King's plea into theater. He turned it into terms. No terrorizing those who cannot see you, he said. No bargains where the price is conscience. No playing at prophecy or imitating revelation. If you conceal, it must be to protect. If you reveal, it must be to guide. If you possess a path, it must be to steer a soul away from harm, not into it. He established restitution not as humiliation but as repair, for repair is how mercy proves it isn't naive. If you take, he said, you return and you mend the hole your taking made. If you frighten, you bring comfort to the exact threshold you darkened. If you mislead, you escort the misled back to the door of clarity and wait until the handle warms in their own hand. He appointed guardians from among the just of their kind, not informers hungry for failure, but shepherds hungry for safety. And he tied authority to reporting like a boat to an anchor, so drift would never pretend to be exploration again. You will have work, he said, because punishment alone breaks, while work rebuilds, and a broken pride that never learns will only seek new disguises. He set rhythms, seasons of building and seasons of watching, nights of patrol in the alleys of the unseen where nightmares grow, days of labor where widows need roofs and travelers need roads. He bound their oaths to remembrance, for an oath without remembrance sours into performance, and he turned their speed into a tithe, not to be spent on bragging, but on the errands of mercy. The Jinn King listened with the thirst that finally admits it is thirst, and does not argue with water anymore. He understood that the response he had received was not the uncoiling of a whip, but the unfolding of a map. And maps rescue wanderers by telling the truth even when the truth shortens the path you wanted to travel. He accepted the covenant aloud so his pride could hear him say it, and then again quietly so his soul could hear it too. He said yes to being measured, yes to being corrected, yes to being useful, yes to being led by a prophet whose honor was submission to Allah. And when the yes finally left his mouth, it felt less like defeat and more like returning a stolen object to its owner and discovering the relief of clean hands. Sulaiman raised his hands with the dignity of a servant and asked Allah to fasten this new obedience to the hearts it touched, to make their strength a canopy and not a shadow, to turn their skill into a ladder for others and never a pit. The wind carried that supplication to roofs and ravines, and even the stones underfoot seemed to hold still as if memorizing it. The hall breathed again, and the Jinn king learned a lesson only repentant leaders learn, that the quiet after a covenant is the sweetest sound a kingdom can make. He stepped back, not smaller but clearer, like a mountain seen after fog lifts, and every loyal soul in the room felt their shoulders lower because the air had decided to be safe. He returned to his people with words that did not sparkle but would last, and his messengers left without drums because truth needs no escort to arrive. He began the work of turning an army into a community of servants, and in that work he found a kind of victory he had not known to pursue. Victory that leaves no orphans. Victory that leaves no widows explaining absence to children who already understand it too well. Victory that leaves the marketplace honest and the night unafraid. And the greatest of those victories was the one lodged in his chest, a pride anchored by gratitude so it could no longer drift out to the old reefs where kings wreck themselves. They began at the edges where harm likes to gather, because mercy patrols the borders before it decorates the center. The strongest among them, once famous for lifting towers as demonstrations, now lifted stones because roofs were leaking over people who prayed. Divers who had treated the sea like a stage dove for beams of coral and ancient timbers to shore up wells that had been tasting of salt and resignation. Swift couriers mapped the night for travelers, stringing invisible threads between safe inns and honest markets, so feet tired from seeking lawful sustenance could step with trust. Their architects turned from labyrinths that trap to pathways that teach, building canals that brought water to fields which had learned the language of dust too fluently. None of this made a noise worth clapping for, and that was the proof they needed to keep going. They discovered the ease that lives inside usefulness, the kind of rest you can only feel when your speed is finally going the right way. They learned to report without drama, lists of tasks completed written in clear lines instead of boasts sung in spirals, and the king read those lists like a treasury, because every repaired hinge is a coin, every shortened queue a jewel, every reconciled neighbor a crown. Sulaiman set overseers who loved justice more than their own theories, and those overseers walked softly through settlements where fear used to sell itself at a premium. They corrected with the same firm courtesy they had received, teaching the young to handle gifts as tools and not props, teaching the old to spend wisdom like wealth instead of hoarding it like a rumor. And when a hand slipped back into mischief, punishment arrived clean and proportionate, never late enough to breed resentment, never early enough to crush learning. Work was the medicine, and slowly the fever of spectacle broke. The court of Sulaiman pulsed like a heart that knew its purpose. Men and jinn and beasts and birds bringing news, requests, plans, and gratitude, each item placed where it belonged, none of it allowed to rot in corners where neglect makes mold of even the best intentions. There were days of vast construction when sheets of crystal were lifted by teams that moved as one will moves, and the floors they laid shone like reminders that clarity underfoot is a mercy all its own. There were nights of quiet repair when a single widow's door was rehung, so the wind would ask permission before entering, and that single night counted as a parade in the ledgers that matter. The jinn who once had sold illusions like sweets learned to sweeten water with patience, stirring the bitterness out of wells whose taste had taught children to accept a smaller life. The scouts who had perfected eavesdropping on folly now listened for loneliness and routed companionship to its address, because protection is not only from blades, but from emptiness that eats at faith. They kept watch over scholars who worked by dim oil, holding back the drowsiness that turns precision into accidents, and they breathed steadiness beside judges wrestling with knots of testimony so that verdicts could land like rain on both parties, accepted for their fairness even when they stung. And through all of it, the memory of their king's plea traveled with them like a quiet drum, the rhythm of teach us to fear Allah more than chains, reminding every hand why it had strength and every foot why it had speed. Sometimes the old itch would return, the desire to pull a curtain of terror across a careless village just to feel large again, but the new order carried antidotes in daily doses, assignments that left no hours free for cruelty to practice, companions who praised usefulness more loudly than they ever cheered spectacle. Temptations arrived and were met with tasks, the way fire is met with water when the bucket is already in your hand. Their ranks began to take pride, the clean kind that belongs to craftsmanship, not the swollen kind that belongs to vanity, and they competed in goodness with a ferocity that used to be reserved for mischief. Reports reached Sulaiman of markets where haggling had softened because truth had grown cheaper to buy, of caravans that now arrived with more alive animals than they left with because kindness had become part of the route, and of neighborhoods that discovered children sleep deeper when the unseen walks the alleys to keep nightmares from rehearsing. He answered such reports with gratitude that traveled back along the same routes like wages paid on time. He reminded them at every gathering that all of this honor would sour if remembrance was neglected, that prayer is the hinge that keeps the door of service swinging the right way, that a single day of vanity can vandalize a month of labor if the heart starts asking to be applauded instead of asking to be accepted. The Jinn king kept the covenant near like a ring, worn not for display, but for reminder. And he learned to visit work sites without announcing himself, to praise in specifics and correct in private, to replace commanders who loved the image of authority with those who loved its responsibility. He set aside days when his fastest would carry messages of peace to human hearts in their sleep, not words to make them dependent, but nudges to make them repentant, so that in the morning a man would return a coin he had been tempted to keep and never know that the unseen had turned his intention gently in the night. He set aside nights when his strongest would stand where harm gathers, crossroads where bitterness likes to recruit, doorways where anger looks for reasons, and their stillness there was a service too. Because sometimes the best construction is the disaster that never happens. In time, the Jinn found a strange humility blossoming where restlessness used to grow, the humility of belonging to a story that does not need them to be spectacular to be saved. They began to measure days by what others did more easily because of them, and that measurement delivered a satisfaction different from the old intoxications, steady instead of spiking, deep instead of loud. And when they gathered at the end of cycles to account for their work, they discovered that accounting had become a kind of worship too. Numbers recited like beads, each total a dua that the next cycle be cleaner, quicker, kinder. The unseen world did not disappear into obedience. It became visible to Allah in a way that pleased their own unseen hearts. And the human world felt the weather of mercy more consistently, not just storms of miracle, but climates of goodness, until the line between the two realms felt less like a border and more like an agreement to serve the same king in different uniforms. All of it by Allah's permission. All of it held together by the response of a prophet who turned a king's trembling into a community's strength. All of it a reminder that when power finally kneels, the world finally stands. Whispers travel faster than banners, and among the Jinn those whispers learned new routes, curling through market stalls built from shadow and over rooftops that never touch a wall, carrying a question that made proud hearts itch: did their king bow out of weakness or wisdom? Some repeated the scene with spite, imagining tremor where there had been steadiness, inventing humiliation so they could avoid humility, while others repeated it with relief, as if a long drought had finally admitted it missed the taste of rain. The story changed color in every mouth, but one color refused to fade, a thin line of fear that ran under every version like a river under sand. Fear that obedience would make them small, fear that service would erase the signatures they had carved into the corners of the world, fear that mercy was just a gentler word for surrender, and fear, when it is not named, becomes advice with a costume on. So advice began to arrive at the king's court, wrapped as strategy, tied as prudence, but smelling of the old pride that had nearly wrecked them. Some urged renegotiation not because the terms were unjust, but because their egos had not been consulted. Some suggested selective obedience, a loyalty that clocks in only when watched. Some whispered, if we must serve, let us serve loudly, so the service itself becomes another stage where we can perform. The king heard them all and remembered the first time he had mistaken volume for truth. He gathered his people in the places where their old habits had trained them to be nimble in wide courts, where wind could carry words without twisting them, at crossroads where feet had to decide a direction, and he spoke plainly enough to make fancy excuses feel overdressed. Fear that makes you clever against obedience is the kind of cleverness that makes you stupid against consequences, he said. If we shrink because we serve, it means we were inflated, not strong. He did not order bravery, he described it until they recognized it, showing how courage is not the refusal to bow, but the choice to bow to the right one. He told them that the old currency startled the simple, confuse the careless. Profit from the fog had been devalued by truth, and anyone still trying to spend it would find themselves begging at windows that no longer opened. He trained the swift to pause without losing speed, and the strong to ask for whom before they asked how much. He assigned mentors whose loyalty had already been tested by quiet work, not performers who loved applause more than outcomes, and he set up councils where even the proud could lay down their weapons without being mocked for having carried them. Whispering did not stop. Whispering never stops. But the content changed, because content always follows leadership's posture the way water follows a channel. New whispers began to spread testimonies of wells tasting sweet again, of roads where travelers slept, of human hearts waking from nightmares without knowing someone had stood guard at the door of their sleep. The fearful found themselves outnumbered not by threats, but by proofs. Even so, pockets of resistance held on, a few elders irritated that respect now came dressed in usefulness instead of legend, a few youths whose fingers still tingled for trouble because they had not yet learned that peace can be an adrenaline too. Sulaiman's overseers met them with the same medicine for different ages education braided with accountability. The young were given assignments that tired out mischief in the muscles, carrying water to farms that counted minutes and measuring bridges, where one missed span could mean someone falls. The old were asked to teach what they wished they had known earlier, and in teaching it they discovered the dignity they thought obedience would steal. A few tried sabotage, small at first, like bending a rule to feel tall, then larger, like turning a helpful rumor back into smoke. The response was firm and clean consequences that returned them to service with a scar that remembered, not a label that ruined. The king learned the rhythm of correction that keeps communities from confusing mercy with lenience. He also learned to spot the whisper that never speaks with its own mouth, the old hiss that mocks any bow to Allah by pretending it is a bow to weakness. That whisper slithered through his chambers one night, offering him a bargain thinner than a shadow, and twice as slippery. Reclaim your edge, it said. Stage a disagreement with the prophet's terms, not to break the covenant, only to remind your people that you still can. He recognized the tone, practiced in gardens older than memory, and answered with the sentence that makes that tone run. The only edge worth keeping is taqwa. The whisper left, and the walls did not shiver, and the king slept. Fear stayed in the city because fear always stays somewhere. But it was relocated to its rightful place. From the throne room to the prayer mat, transformed from anxiety about losing status into awe about meeting Allah. Mothers told children a new bedtime story about a king who begged not to live, but to live rightly. And the children grew up wanting not fame, but function. Craftsmen began to mark their work with a quiet sign that meant by permission. And those marks turned products into promises, so markets calmed down because trust is the cheapest security system. The Jinn learned to measure themselves by how little fear they sold and how much safety they produced. The king visited teams at the edges where the old thrill had once lived, the dark intersections where a crouched cruelty used to wait, and he found that the dark had been occupied by patience. Patience standing still until anger walked past and realized it had no audience. Patience breathing beside grief until grief let go of the idea that revenge was a cousin of justice. Patience that looked boring to egos but looked like shelter to souls. Reports returned less decorated but more dense, full of numbers that could be checked and names that could be thanked, and the king developed a taste for this new kind of sweetness, the taste of a day that ends with more order than it started with. He gathered his people again and taught them a sentence they began to pass down like a family heirloom. The fear that keeps you from sin is a friend. The fear that keeps you from service is a thief. By Allah's permission, the thief found fewer doors unlocked. Even the skeptics began to tire of their own suspicion, like men who keep tasting their food for poison, long after the antidote has been mixed into the meal. They looked around and saw something suspicion could not argue with, gates that squeaked less, debts that shrank, quarrels that ended before they could hire an audience, nights that passed without a child waking to scream at nothing. Whispers became thank yous, and thank yous, repeated often enough, become character. What haunted them after fear was not humiliation but revelation. The lesson hiding inside every day's work, like a seed inside fruit power, had lied to them about what it island. They had been trained by their own legends to think power was a shout heard across valleys and a shadow cast across crowds. But the valleys were greener now, and the crowds were calmer, and the shout had become unnecessary because the right things were happening without it. The lesson came to them the way dawn teaches roofs to glow, slowly, and then all at once. They realized that power, which needs to be proved every hour, is not power but panic with jewelry on. That the kind of strength that multiplies when shared and purifies when measured is the only strength that will not turn on its owner. Sulaiman taught this lesson without chalk, drawing it instead on the floor of his court with outcomes. He did not ask the wind to bow so he could feel tall. He asked it to carry relief to fields tired of pretending dust was enough. He did not demand the birds assemble to make a crown of movement above his head. He listened when a small one brought news, and listening became the crown. He did not parade the Jinn as trophies. He trusted them as trustees, and the trust worked because it was tied to accountability the way a tent is tied to its pegs. The Jinn king saw that the prophet's authority did not leak when it flowed through others. It grew clearer. People in his realm started to say things that sounded ordinary and felt miraculous. My neighbor helped me before I asked. The road is safe after sunset. I found what I lost on the path where I lost it, and those sentences built a monument taller than any spire. Power, they learned, is the habit of making it easier for others to do what is right. It is the art of removing excuses from evil and putting handles on good, so even tired hands can lift it. It is not the right to take more, but the capacity to return more than you took. It is not a chair that needs height, it is a floor that needs level. And all of it is a trust that either glows with gratitude or rots with vanity. This lesson hurt a little at first because truth always presses where pride has set up its furniture. A few of the king's oldest companions asked whether a life without spectacle was worth being immortal for, and he answered with a story that finally felt like home. When a man sleeps safely, a child eats sweetly, a scholar writes clearly, and a widow smiles without remembering to be afraid, that is what we were given strength for. He told them that loud victories are weddings and quiet victories are marriages, and only one of those lasts long enough to build a family. They tested the lesson in 100 different laboratories, on the scaffolds where roofs were relaid, in the court where testimony arrived tangled and left untied, at the wells where taste turned from brine to blessing, and the results repeated until even doubters had to admit repetition was evidence, not coincidence. A young Jinn with hands too quick for his own patience asked how he could feel the thrill he missed without returning to the old games, and the king gave him a task that looked dull from far away and sparkled up close: map the quiet. The youth returned a month later with routes where arguments used to begin but no longer found a stage, with corners where thieves had stopped meeting because light arrived there exactly when needed, with houses where children slept through storms because someone had taught the shutters to hold. This, the king said, is the thrill of stewardship. Another asked whether power without fear would invite disrespect, and the answer arrived before the king could speak, in the posture of a farmer who looked up when the team passed and nodded the way. Men nod when they are too grateful to clap. Respect born of relief stands taller than respect born of intimidation because it doesn't need to be reminded. The lesson also corrected the city's accounting. For years they had counted only what could be displayed: fortresses, feats, rare objects carried from far-off coasts before the tea had cooled, but now ledgers filled with different entries. Hours of peace returned to parents, arguments shortened by honesty, markets that closed earlier because fairness had made profit efficient, miles of road that no longer needed patrol because intention had been repaved. Numbers grew duller and life grew brighter, and they learned that dull numbers are often the ones Allah loves to see grow. Sulaiman reinforced the lesson the way rain reinforces a river regularly. He convened gatherings where the smallest report was treated as the most delicate jewel, and the largest feat was praised briefly so attention could return to the habits that make large feats possible without breaking anything. He corrected language that betrayed the old disease, forbidding phrases like, "we terrified them into compliance," and replacing them with, "we helped them choose what was right," because tongues build worlds, and a tongue that keeps saying fear will eventually need fear to stay in business. He reminded them of the ant's warning that saved a nation of ants from being crushed under a march that did not intend to harm, and of the bird whose message prevented a queen from choosing a path that would have hardened her people, and he drew a line through both examples to the same sentence written above all: guidance is the greatest use of strength. The king began to see his own throne differently, not as a seat that lifted him, but as a station that located him, placing him exactly where responsibility could find him without delay. He started each cycle with a dua that turned into policy. "O Allah, make my power heavy with gratitude and light on ego." And then he designed checks that would prove whether the dua had reached the ground: unscheduled audits of places where he himself was adored, unexpected questions posed to people his policies touched but whose names never reached him, unannounced visits to the alleys where promises go to be forgotten. The more he practiced the lesson, the less he needed to say it, because cities memorized the posture of their leaders. The Jinn who once fan-danced with flames began to keep water near wherever they performed heat, and that precaution saved more lives than any audience will ever clap for. The swift who once raced to arrive first at mischief now raced to arrive first at service, and a new kind of reputation grew among them, the kind measured in rescue times rather than rumor times. Even their games changed. Contests now rewarded the team that made life easiest for the most people, and victories were celebrated by giving away the prize to the smallest contributor, training hearts to love the invisible hinge more than the visible door. They taught their children that the opposite of weakness is not arrogance, but worship, and that the opposite of fear is not recklessness, but trust. They told them that power can be a mirror that breaks the face staring into it, or a window that lets more light in, and the only carpentry that matters is learning which one you are building. The city's sound changed too. It lost the pitch of constant alarm and found the frequency of steady work, the hum that means a machine is well oiled, the susurrus that means a garden is being cared for. In that sound, the king heard his own old restlessness fade, replaced by a patience that did not feel like waiting, but like moving at the speed of trust. He visited Sulaiman and reported not triumphs but trends. And Sulaiman heard what every true leader loves to hear, the sound of delegated goodness becoming native habit. He reminded the king that even this lesson can be lost if gratitude is not renewed. And together they asked Allah to keep them small where they should be small, and strong where they should be strong, to keep their names weak and their service loud, to keep their obedience visible to Him, even if it remained invisible to those who benefited. And as the gathering dispersed, the wind moved like a clerk closing a ledger at the end of a profitable day, and the city slept with fewer locks, because locks are a tax you pay when power forgets why it was given. He feared many things, and none of them were the prophet before him. What unsettled him most lived behind his own ribs, a quiet tremor that asked whether his people could stay steady when the applause of pride was replaced by the soft wages of service. He had bent, and bending had set him free, but would the young who adored velocity mistake obedience for a wall? Would the old who collected stories like coins feel poor when legends were retired and truth was paid out in daily bread? At night, he walked the galleries of his mind where portraits of previous victories still tried to shine, and he noticed how their eyes followed him as if asking to be invited back into power. He remembered how easily cleverness can arrange disobedience to look like strategy, how swiftly the tongue can dress a relapse in robes labeled necessity. He spoke to his heart, the way a father speaks to a son eager to run too far. Too much strength without direction is only an accident rehearsing, and the heart listened because it had just learned how to be led. He placed sentries along the borders of habit, setting rhythms that would not leave empty rooms for arrogance to rent, assigning elders to watch the thresholds where jokes become cruelty and where confidence becomes disregard. He learned to fear delays that carried no good reason, because delay is often the alias of temptation, and he answered temptation with tasks before its letters could even finish arranging themselves into a message. Sometimes, lying awake, he heard the old hiss rehearsing an old indictment. You bowed to a human, and he met it with the sentence that has cooled more fires than rivers. I bowed where Allah's order stood. When reports of small rebellions reached him, a prank that frightened a village's children, a trick that made an honest merchant doubt his mind, he did not erupt. He arrived with the kind of certainty that does not shout. He separated the impulsive from the malicious. He turned mischief into labor and malice, into lessons that hurt enough to remember but not enough to ruin, and he made it clear that in this new reign, the quickest route back to honor was through repair. He gathered the quick and the proud into long sessions where words were not decorations but tools, and he taught a vocabulary that left little room for vanity to hide. replacing phrases like "we showed them" with "we served them," swapping the thrill of being feared for the dignity of being trusted. He instituted a private rite that bound him to the covenant even when no eyes were on him, a time just before dawn when he reviewed the day ahead, asking where his decisions might scratch the paint of justice and how to sand them smooth before they went into motion. He feared becoming a cautionary tale told by his own grandchildren, so he wrote down his fears and used them as checklists rather than ghosts, converting dread into design the way a wise captain turns reefs into maps that save others from tearing their hulls. The more he practiced, the more the fear changed shape, no longer a storm that threatened to drown him, but a tide that reminded him to tie every boat. He understood that being afraid of sin is part of taqwa, and he fed that fear only the kind of attention that makes it a guard dog and not a tyrant, a sentinel that wakes you to pray rather than a panic that paralyzes you. Still, there were days when his old swagger tested the fences, when the memory of the audience's gasp tried to audition for a role in his new life. And on those days he visited work sites where the only applause was a door closing properly, where the only ovation was a roof that kept rain in its place. He listened to the gratitude of widows who had learned to sleep without listening for intruders, and he let their thanks outweigh any craving for drama. He sat with apprentices whose gifts were obvious and whose discipline was still fragile, telling them the story of the first command and the refusal that has been echoing since, and they learned to hear that echo as a warning not to imitate, but to avoid. He taught them to measure bravery by truth told to oneself and mercy given to others, to distrust any assignment that paid only in spectacle, to love any duty that produced peace. Others could feel more than they could describe. He feared failing them, yes, but he feared something else even more, failing the one who had let him bow without breaking, and that fear became a light that made every corridor navigable. He stood often at the margin of a court that did not make noise to prove order, but arranged itself like a prayer that has memorized its reasons. In Sulaiman's hall, men brought disputes wrapped in details and left with decisions wrapped in justice. Birds arrived with messages that looked small and turned out to bridge kingdoms, and beasts settled into calm because they had learned that in this space no one would ask them to be anything other than what they were made to be. The Jinn king watched a procession of humble miracles, a mechanic who spoke with engineers about a wheel that squeaked dishonestly and left with a plan that turned friction into warning, a farmer who argued with a neighbor about a furrow of water and left with an irrigation schedule that taught both of them to arrive early for justice and leave late with gratitude. He heard the cadence of a governance that burned no fuel on vanity, where minutes were currency and clarity was a tax that everyone gladly paid, where messengers knew that the shortest distance between 2 points is not speed, but purpose. He learned the rhythms of petitions and the etiquette of listening, how Sulaiman let words empty themselves of heat before weighing their meaning, how he asked the question that cut the knot rather than displayed the knife, how he made people taller by holding them to standards rather than by putting others in holes. He saw the Hudhuds return from distant lands, treated not as spectacle, but as stewardship, news evaluated for what it could build rather than for how brightly it flared, and he recognized in that discipline the safety of truth. He watched as a judgment about an orphan's property unfolded like a careful unfolding of a fragile garment, witnesses questioned without mockery, documents read with a patience that left no corner in shadow, and he understood that awe is not only for thunder but for fairness, done well. The architecture itself seemed to practice obedience, pillars standing like character, floors reflecting like intention, doors opening and closing with the certainty that nothing rushed would be allowed to spill into chaos. In one corner, scholars argued softly about measurements that determine when a debt is forgiven and when it is transformed into charity. and Sulaiman let the argument ripen before gleaning it. And from that gleaning came a policy that rescued the poor from despair, without letting negligence pretend to be misfortune. On another day, he witnessed a gathering where artisans presented inventions: a lamp that used less oil but gave more light, a pulley that spared backs without spoiling effort, and he saw how the prophet's questions purified ambition until it became service, how praise was given just enough to kindle excellence without stoking arrogance. Sometimes the court turned its attention to the wide world beyond its walls, assigning patrols not of soldiers first, but of helpers, mapping not only threats, but absences where help had never been and should have been, sending strength to the seams where societies tear. The Jinn King took his place at the edge, not exiled but learning, and he carried away from those hours a sense that majesty is not the crown's glitter, but the law's gentleness when it is strong. That splendor is not gold under the foot, but rightness in the next decision. That glory is the name given to mercy when it survives testing. He watched Sulaiman thank Allah openly in moments when lesser rulers would have thanked themselves, and that public gratitude untied knots in the room that none of them had noticed until the knots were gone. He saw humility in places where he had been trained by legend to expect intimidation, and he felt a belonging that did not require him to perform. Even the silences taught him things, the way quiet settled after a just verdict, not because people were afraid to speak, but because their speech did not need to defend itself against doubt. He found himself imitating courtesy that had not been demanded of him, catching his own impatience before it spilled, adjusting his stance when someone weaker approached, lowering his tone when the truth did not require volume. On a morning that smelled of rain deciding whether to fall, he watched as a queen's matter was discussed with a delicacy that proved strength and a firmness that honored intelligence, and he learned again that the greatest display a court can offer is a decision that leaves no residue of humiliation behind. He returned to his people with sights turned into policies, with wonder distilled into practices, with awe translated into schedules, and they felt the difference. Because anyone can feel when majesty has learned to be useful. He wore no fetters on his wrists, yet something held him, and the holding felt like safety rather than prison. They were chains that no eye could sketch, but every choice could feel. Links forged from the day of his plea, and tempered in the hours of his repentance. And each link had a name that did not humiliate him: truth, gratitude, restraint, service, remembrance. When his mind wandered to the old cliffs where kings posture, the chain of truth tugged, reminding him that posturing is only falling practiced with style. When his tongue reached for the easy boast, the chain of gratitude pulled it back into honesty and made space for a quieter sentence that built trust instead of applause. When anger flared at delay or insult, the chain of restraint cooled it into judgment, and what might have exploded into a spectacle settled into a verdict that people could live with. He taught his captains to wear these chains too, not as decorations to show off in times of peace, but as gear required for any expedition that claimed to protect. He wrote down the rules of these unseen bonds so memory could not claim ignorance later, and he made them revive the writing when it faded, tracing the letters with hands that had once traced runes for mischief. An opportunity arrived that would have lured the old king into shouting a distant border clan insulted a treaty and invited retaliation large enough to feed pride for a decade, and the chain tugged again, asking the questions that chains always ask: what restores? What teaches? What repairs? He sent envoys fast enough to surprise and gentle enough to be welcomed, and they returned not with trophies, but with terms accepted, with a misunderstanding corrected before it had time to dress up as defiance. The young who had expected a parade of force instead watched a choreography of mercy, and some of them felt disappointment stumble into respect, because results have a way of educating fantasies. Another chance came to Crow, a season of plenty following a season of restraint, and his advisors suggested speeches that would immortalize his wisdom, but the chain of service redirected the pen to policies that made the plenty reach hungers that did not vote or flatter. He realized then that the chains were not obstacles laid across his path, but rails laid along it, keeping power from tipping into harm, keeping victories from mutating into idols. Some nights he dreamed he had taken them off and woke with relief, heavy as mercy, because in the dream his steps grew loud again and his people grew small again, and he remembered that freedom without obedience is only another word for wandering. He taught his people to love their own chains, the way sailors love the ropes that keep sails honest, the way climbers love the lines that keep gravity from making fools of confidence, the way worshippers love the times of prayer that keep days from dissolving into appetite. He added a practice to their councils, a ritual of recounting invisible salvations, each leader offering one moment in the last cycle where a chain had kept a disaster from taking its first breath, and those recountings turned into a culture, and that culture turned into a kind of armor that did not creak. Old companions who had once equated freedom with improvisation began to admit that discipline tasted better on the second sip, that the first sip is always the hardest, because pride expects bitterness and is surprised by sweetness. He tested the chains, the only way chains can be tested by trying to move against them, and each time he did, he found not bruises but bearings, the way a compass answers a heart that wants to be lost with a simple, stubborn "no, here." The binding changed how he carried memory too. The humiliation he had feared became a hinge that opened doors to good he could not have entered otherwise, and the temptation to remember himself as a victim of his own bowing dried up because the chains would not allow that lie to sit down. He noticed how easily gratitude becomes the grammar of a life once the chains are accepted. Phrases like "by permission" and "as a trust" and "in service to" became the stitching on every plan, and plans built with such stitching survived weather that ruins bragging. He expected the unseen bonds to tire him, but they steadied him instead, redistributing weight to places designed to carry it, sparing his mind the exhausting labor of inventing justifications, sparing his soul the ache of pretending not to know what is right. On a day when Sulaiman traveled to a region that needed his presence, the court breathed without its center visible, and temptation paraded itself nearby dressed in a compliment. Now is the moment to prove you can fill the space. And the chain of remembrance answered first. The only space worth filling is the one Allah assigns. He stayed at the edge where he belonged, and found that belonging felt like honor, not like exile. He used the absence as a lesson, drilling his own counsel on what to do when visibility decreases, turning down the brightness of personalities so procedures could glow, making sure no single hand was so necessary that its absence would mean collapse. He told them that the best chain is the one a community places around its own temptation to be careless. And he watched as they began to love those chains too, because loving safety is easier when you have seen havoc up close. In quiet moments, he imagined the day when all chains are measured and all freedoms are weighed, when crowns are revealed as either halos of service or hoops of smoke, and he asked Allah to keep his bonds tight until then, to keep the key in the pocket of mercy, and never in the hand of his ego. He taught the smallest among his kind to practice a simple exercise. Before any trick is tried, ask if truth could do the job faster. Before any speed is spent, ask if patience could get you there safer. Before any secret is kept, ask if clarity would heal more quickly, and then feel the chain settle into place like a belt before a run. In time, he forgot what it felt like to be bothered by the holding, and remembered only the relief of being guided. If he missed anything, he missed the noise of himself, and missing that is a mercy too, because some silences are full of better music. He would look sometimes at the younger faces around him, faces that did not flinch at the word serve, faces that glowed when a job was done right rather than loudly, and he knew the chains had become inheritance rather than sentence. And on evenings when the city felt like a promise kept, he would walk the roofs where wind keeps its own counsel and thank the one who had taught him to accept what holds, so that he could finally hold what matters, whispering the only boast he allowed himself, "I was bound, and therefore I am free." Iblis does not always arrive with a trumpet. More often he arrives with a compliment sharpened into a hook. The Jinn King learned this on a night when the city slept like a prayer answered, and the moon hung low, as if listening. The whisper did not scold him for bowing. It praised him for doing it so beautifully that perhaps he had earned a small rebellion as a treat. "Balance," the whisper said, "requires a little disobedience to keep your edge. Lunt." He almost smiled at the cleverness that had fooled him in younger days, then answered with the sentence that unthreads that fabric, "Balance is obedience divided into parts, not obedience mixed with sin." The room cooled. The whisper tried a second door, offering him a future where his name would be recited as the Jinn who knelt yet stayed untamed, a legend comfortable enough for pride to sleep inside it. He remembered the first refusal to bow and how that refusal keeps inventing new costumes, and he tightened the belt of remembrance around his thoughts. He set a rule for himself that night, a chain he invited rather than endured, that when praise rises, it must be escorted by gratitude before it is allowed to sit, and when ambition rises, it must be searched for arrogance before it is allowed to speak. He trained his captains in the detection of whispers, not by hunting shadows but by watching outcomes, because the devil's arguments often sound like wisdom until you measure what they leave behind. They created a small science from Dicker, a discipline of pausing long enough for remembrance to cool a hot thought into a clear one, a practice of letting the tongue say, "By Allah's permission," so the hand remembers whose work it does. He mapped the pathways by which misguidance travels through fatigue that seeks shortcuts, through vanity that seeks mirrors, through anger that seeks witnesses, and he built stations of mercy along those roads, places where a tired will could rest, a flattered will could be corrected, an angry will could be alone until it grew honest. When a rumor arrived that his new gentleness meant softness, Iblis tried to turn it into a test of masculinity, a dare disguised as advice, and the king answered by doing the firm thing the gentle way, punishing what needed punishing, with the kind of clarity that leaves no wound for resentment to live in. He learned to separate the voice in him that wanted to be good from the voice that wanted to be seen being good, and he taught his people to do the same, telling them that sincerity is the difference between a light and a performance about a light. Iblis grew subtler. He whispered to scholars that their precision could be a cudgel, to poets that their beauty could be a leash, to builders that their speed could be a throne, and the king replied by changing pay. Not speeches rewarding patience in scholars, humility in poets, safety in builders, until payment itself became a sermon the whisper could not outpreach. He revised the festivals, reducing any ceremony that fattened egos, and enlarging any rite that fed the poor, weaving remembrance into calendars so the city could not wander too far before a holy day found it. When his own heart asked him for a private indulgence, he answered it with a private service, balancing appetite with charity until the appetite forgot it was hungry. He taught the young a test they could carry in their sleeves. If the idea grows larger when someone is watching, it is probably a trap. He taught the old a test they could carry in their pockets. If the memory makes you look large and God small, retell it until it does the opposite. Dell. He knew the shadow would keep returning, so he refused to be surprised by it, meeting it the way a guard meets night, prepared, polite, and unafraid. Some evenings he walked the alleys where he had once sold fear wholesale and listened to the new sound there, the hush of people not needing to look over their shoulders, and he told himself that this quiet is the true answer to every whisper. He spoke with fathers who admitted they had used fright stories to control their children, and taught them gentler stories where obedience grows from love, and he spoke with traders who had traded in suspicion, and taught them that trust is a currency that multiplies faster. He even visited the old dens where Jinn had bartered illusions and turned those places into schools, and the first lesson on every door was the sentence that undoes the boast: all strength is on loan. Iblis hated that sentence because it drains temptation of theater. The king loved it because it made work easier. And when the shadow finally tried flattery shaped like piety, "You have become an example," it hissed, "so perhaps you can relax now." The king smiled and answered, "An example is only a mirror, and mirrors are not the face." He returned to the tasks that make flattery forget your address, and the city returned to sleeping like a prayer that expects to be answered again tomorrow. Sulaiman pointed often without pointing, drawing their eyes to the signs stitched into everything, and the Jinn king learned to read the world like a scripture whose verses you can step on. At dawn, he watched the antlines reroute after a single leaf fell in their road. No arguments, no manifestos, only a pivot so graceful it honored the law that wrote their instincts. He told his captains, "This is obedience moving faster than pride," and the sentence traveled through the ranks as a proverb. Over fields that used to be dust, he saw clouds assemble with a timing that made music of patience, and when rain fell, it chose places that had prepared, teaching him that Rizq loves discipline. He studied birds whose counsels begin with silence, how one small body breaks formation to scout a wind and returns to teach the rest, and he marveled that their smallest member could move an entire sky with a decision. He visited cliffs where plants had learned to hold on without dramatics, roots negotiating with stone until both could remain themselves and coexist, and he told his judges to copy that, to write verdicts that hold firm without breaking the people they are meant to hold. He went down to the waters where divers among his kind retrieved old timbers and late pearls, and he watched currents teach the lesson that force can be gentle, and gentle can be force, that a river cuts a path by insisting without shouting, that the sea's generosity is measured by the moon's restraint. On nights when the wind carried news faster than tongues, he remembered that the wind obeys without fatigue, and he told his messengers that their speed should be obedience wearing sandals, not ego wearing wings. In orchards, he learned from fruit, how sweetness stores sunlight without boasting about it, how ripeness arrives without trumpets and leaves behind a seed. And he asked his builders, "Where is the seed in this project?" until they began designing for inheritance rather than applause. He watched Sulaiman pause before judgments to thank Allah for the capacity to judge, and in that pause he saw a whole theology of governance, that gratitude is the hinge upon which wisdom swings into the right room. He stood with shepherds while storms gathered, reading the sky's shoulders the way they did, learning that leadership's first duty is to calculate roots of safety before roots of glory. And he returned to his councils with maps that bent around the weak, the way rivers bend around stones that cannot move themselves. He learned to read ruins too, the bones of houses that had not respected the lean of a hill or the memory of a floodplain, and he told his architects that arrogance has an architectural style, and it always collapses beautifully and expensively. He found verses in the smallest creatures: a spider rebuilding a web after wind's lesson, a bee correcting its route after tasting a flower that had lied about its nectar, and he taught his scribes to love corrections, to see edits as worship rather than shame. He let mountains tutor his temper, their patience with the insults of weather, their refusal to hurry even when the river mocked them with motion, and he began to love decisions that age well, more than decisions that shine quickly. Sometimes Sulaiman would speak gently of the stars as timekeepers, and of shadows as teachers, of morning as a promise, and evening as a report, and the king kept those metaphors like tools arranged in a belt, using them to fix pieces of his nation that had grown squeaky with self-importance. He encouraged poets to write about irrigation and tailors to write about mercy, until poetry itself began to serve, and he invited mathematicians to calculate fairness until numbers began to sing. He learned the ayah that is a widow's sigh when a door closes properly for the first time in months, the ayah that is a debtor's shoulders lowering after a fair settlement, the ayah that is a scholar's smile when a hard passage becomes clear just before dawn. He taught his people to greet these signs with Alhamdulillah the way gardens greet rain with green, and the city's speech became softer and truer. When a quake shuddered through a distant valley and did less harm than the elders remembered quakes doing, he traveled to see why, and found houses built with humility toward the earth, foundations that listened to the soil before telling it what to carry, and he funded an academy to teach that listening. He ordered his swiftest to map the patterns of wind, where fires like to begin, and to plant breaks where flames lose appetite. And when a season passed without smoke, every rooftop said, "Praise be to Allah," and meant it. The more he read, the more the book enlarged, until even silence felt like a verse between chapters, and in that verse he found space to remember who authored all of it. He realized he had once sought miracles to prove power. Now he sought patterns to prove gratitude. He realized he had once demanded signs to guide him. Now he discovered signs everywhere because he had finally chosen to be guided. 0, 5. And when his people asked what the greatest sign was, he answered with a softness that landed like certainty, a heart turning back quickly. For a turning heart is a sunrise many eyes miss, because they are looking at the horizon, not the mirror. The day arrived when command tested them not with a philosophy but with a weight, a task so immense it would either break their old bones or prove their new ones. Floods had eaten a valley's roads, farms were stranded like islands, markets had been cut into little archipelagos of hunger, and Sulaiman ordered a causeway raised from bedrock to bread, a path for relief to move like prayer moves, directly and with humility. The order crossed the city not as a rumor but as a rhythm, and the Jinn answered without flinching, speed tightening its laces, strength rolling up its sleeves, cleverness taking off its jewelry and putting on its gloves. The king watched the muster with a heart that remembered 2 lives at once, the old one that would have turned this into a theater, and the new one that wanted only results that feed. He divided teams by gifts and tethered each gift to a need, sending lifters to shoulder stones, divers to anchor piers, makers of glass to shape signal beacons that would not lie in fog. And he assigned the most disciplined to the most invisible tasks, because unseen excellence is what keeps bridges honest. The first stones sank into mud that had forgotten how to hold, and the work could have stalled while blame looked for a place to live. But obedience arrived first with a better idea. Lay woven mats of palm and reed below the stone, and the valley began to remember its strength. Days piled on days. Nights stitched them. The wind learned new routes to carry instructions. The sun set on backs determined to rise early enough to defeat regret. The king walked the line not as an inspector angry for imperfections, but as a servant hunting for obstacles to move, and his presence turned grumbling into solutions because men correct themselves when they are respected. He chose to sleep near the site, on ground that belonged to someone else's need, and the sight of a king choosing hard earth as a pillow did more sermons work than sermons sometimes can. He watched his people obey Sulaiman's command with a precision that made him both rejoice and ache. Rejoice because obedience had become a muscle, ache because he wanted that muscle to flex for Allah even when no prophet's eye supervised. So he gathered them at dusk, and spoke not of schedules but of secrets. Let your hands say Bismillah when they lift. Let your feet say Subhanallah when they place. Let your back say Alhamdulillah when they straighten. Then even if all eyes close, the work will continue facing the right direction. They said Amin with the sincerity that sweat teaches. On the seventh day, a storm threatened to test the half-built spine of the causeway, and old nerves twitched, remembering collapses that make stories longer than they make bridges. But obedience did not panic. Teams shifted to wine duty, lines of Jinn standing where gusts wanted to bully, weights redistributed with the intelligence of ants. And when the storm's temper finished, the work stood, not proud, just present. Farmers from the marooned fields began to risk crossings at low points, and the workers paused what they were building to carry what mattered more: children, medicines, news of who needed relief first, and the project gained a soul in that moment because its purpose walked on it. By the time the last stone settled and the first full cart rattled across with grain that would turn into prayers, the king felt the sweetest fatigue, the kind that does not calculate glory, the kind that sleeps without checking if applause has arrived. Sulaiman came to see, and his gratitude traveled ahead of him like shade, and the city felt the mercy of being seen by a ruler who thanks Allah more loudly than he thanks himself. The Jinn, who had once trained for shock, learned that day to train for steadiness, and their competitions changed again, racing not for first arrival but for best reinforcement, boasting not about speed alone, but about accuracy that saves lives quietly. The king returned to his court and wrote policies while the dust of labor still lived on his skin, tying future orders to this day so memory could not drift, requiring that any command begin with purpose, continue with protection for the weakest, and end with a plan for who inherits the maintenance. He instituted a habit at the close of great works, a collective sajda of thanks performed separately but at the same hour, invisible as the wind, and just as binding. And he discovered that the city's troubles softened after those hours, as if gratitude greased the hinges of fate. 5. He walked the new road at night and listened to its silence, a silence that meant trade would resume without theft demanding a tax. Families would reunite without fear hiring a storyteller. Scholars would travel with their footnotes intact, and he said the one boast that had become permissible to him: by Allah's permission, we have made it easier for others to do what is right. That ease bred a refinement inside him, the clean sorrow that he had not always lived this way, and the clean joy that he could live this way now. He ordered his scribes to record not the length of the bridge, but the length of patience it required, not the names of the famed foremen, but the names of the quiet ones who kept measures true. And those records turned into curricula, and those curricula turned into a culture where obedience became the craft everyone wanted to master. As seasons turned and the causeway aged into the landscape, the king noticed a change in his people's gait, a stride less eager to impress and more eager to arrive with what others needed. And he knew the day of obedience had not ended with the project. It had begun there, and now moved through kitchens and courts, farms and schools, markets and marriages, teaching the same lesson in 1,000 accents, that submission is the only route that never closes. He returned to Sulaiman to report not completion but continuation, and the prophet nodded the way mountains nod, without moving, saying only, Alhamdulillah, and the word covered the bridge, the valley, the city, and the small bright place behind the Jinn king's ribs where fear used to live. Hour polished for his soul to see its face in. He could still feel the cool of the floor meeting his forehead and the strange lightness that entered his bones when the heavy word finally left his mouth: mercy. He could still hear the hush in the court when pride was exchanged for truth at a rate no market would ever match, and he kept that sound like a talisman against the old noise that used to mistake applause for oxygen. He wrote the date on a small tablet and carried it as others carry a family name. And when a young captain asked why a king would keep a reminder of a moment most rulers would hide, he answered, "Because the day I begged is the day my reign began." He made that sentence a practice, repeating it at dawn before orders were issued, and at dusk before reports were heard, until his inner weather learned to expect humility like fields expect rain. He visited places where his old style had left dents, alleys where fear had been priced as entertainment, and corners where confusion had been sold as wisdom, and he spent his own authority there like alms, repairing the small damages that make large disasters possible. He sought out those he had wronged, not with dramatics, but with the quiet bravery of accountability, returning what could be returned, mending what could be mended, and asking Allah to heal what no hand could reach. He gathered the swiftest and told them the story without embellishment, how a proud mouth discovered the taste of honesty and found it sweeter than any victory wine. And he taught them to practice small daily beggings that keep the heart limber. Forgive me for the sharp word. Guide me through this judgment. Protect me from myself when I am tired. He instituted a day each month called the Day of Returning, when every rank, from the most hidden scout to the most visible elder, named one mistake aloud and named the repair they had made, and those sessions turned shame into a ladder rather than a pit. He learned to cherish interruption when it came from truth, allowing a servant to correct him in a detail without punishing the courage that dared to speak, because a king who begged once can bear to be told he has erred again. The memory guided him during temptations that arrived in the respectable close of urgency, a messenger declaring that an insult at a distant border demanded immediate thunder, and he tasted the old spark that once loved the theater of retaliation. He placed his hand on the tablet of the day he begged and felt pride's heat lose its appetite. He sent inquiry before outrage, accuracy before anger, and the insult turned out to be a mistranslation rescued by patience. He met a young Jinn whose fingers loved mischief the way dry wood loves flame, and he told him the story as a warning wrapped in warmth. I once thought speed was proof, and spectacle was meaning. And the youth listened, because the voice that admits wrong is the only voice that can teach certain rights. He redesigned ceremonies so that gratitude outshone grandeur, making the biggest applause when applause was needed, for the quietest rescues and longest repairs, and he watched pride starve gently rather than be starved harshly. He kept one ritual private, a sujood of remembering, performed wherever he happened to be when a decision tempted the old self, and when his forehead touched the ground, strategy learned to wait for sincerity to arrive. He taught his counselors the grammar of repentance that does not collapse into self-pity, showing them how to move from "I have sinned" to "I will serve" without stopping in "I am worthless," because despair is a vanity wearing ashes. He told them that begging is not a lease you renew only when threatened, but a home you maintain even in peace, and they began to practice asking before taking, thanking before keeping, and returning before being asked. His enemies tried to use the story against him, crafting ballads where the king's knees trembled like reeds, and he answered not with censorship, but with results that made the ballads sound small, because a repaired street speaks louder than a mocking song. The memory did not humiliate him, it edited him. It turned his reflexes from sharp to sure, turned his appetite from being seen to being useful, turned his plans from saving face to saving people. And when he lay down on nights that had been crowded with choices, the tablet of the day he begged glowed in memory like a lighthouse, and sleep arrived with the confidence that comes from having faced the right direction. He knew the story was not written only for beings born of flame and speed. It had been stitched for anyone whose heart rehearses pride and whose hands can learn obedience, which is to say, for every son of Adam and every daughter of Eve. He spoke to merchants who once believed suspicion was the safest investment and taught them that trust wisely placed earns interest in both worlds. He spoke to craftsmen who measured their worth by how loudly their work was praised and showed them the joy of a hinge that never squeaks again, even if no one remembers the name of the hand that fixed it. He spoke to rulers who felt tall only when others felt small and offered them a different geometry, where height is measured by how many can stand under your shade without shivering. He spoke to parents learning the difficult art of shaping without crushing, reminding them that guidance is a river that carries, not a hammer that shatters, and that a child who learns to love Allah obeys more securely than a child who only fears a parent. He spoke to youths who mistook daring for depth and invited them to try a harder courage, the courage of apology, the courage of returning a coin that no one noticed they kept, the courage of being the first to say peace when tempers are hungry. He spoke to the exhausted who thought obedience required a theater and taught them that it often requires what they already have: a moment, a mouth, a choice pointed the right way. He spoke to the learned whose precision threatened to become pride and urged them to lace their knowledge with mercy so that medicine would not become a knife. And always, beneath the counsel, he laid the foundation that had saved him. You were created for worship, not the thin worship of public performance, but the thick worship of private choices, the worship that begins before dawn, when no one claps, and continues at noon, when the world rushes and ends, after midnight, when only Allah sees the ledger. He told them that repentance is not a courtroom where you argue mitigation, but a doorway where you remove your shoes and step into better. He taught them to ask for forgiveness quickly so sins cannot harden into habits, to fix harm visibly so repair can teach witnesses, to set fences for themselves that pride cannot easily jump. He reminded them that Shaitan sells on credit with terrible terms, and that the only bargain worth making is the one where you trade a little embarrassment now for a lifetime of ease later. He showed them how to keep remembrance near, a dhikr resting under the tongue like a seed ready for rain, so that when anger knocks, Astaghfirullah answers first. When vanity smiles, Alhamdulillah wipes the mirror. When fear shivers, Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil warms the room. He asked the proud to imagine the ground that would one day hold them, not to frighten them into grimness, but to free them from the silliness of pretending immortality. And he asked the timid to imagine the sky that had been telling their hearts to lift all along, not to pump them with arrogance, but to fill them with trust. He told leaders to practice the humility that makes correction easy, spouses to practice the patience that makes tenderness believable, neighbors to practice the generosity that makes fences friendly rather than hostile. He taught that mercy without structure drifts and structure without mercy crushes, and that both belong to worship when worship refuses to be lazy. He did not present piety as a fog, but as a map, marking routes where people could walk tomorrow morning. Pay the debt you can pay today. Learn the name of the widow 3 doors down. Return the tool you've kept too long. Delete the boast you dressed as advice. Forgive the small injury before it becomes a grievance that breeds. He wanted hearts to feel the relief he had found on the floor of Sulaiman's hall without needing a hall or a king, and so he repeated until repetition turned into guidance. Begging for mercy is not the end of dignity, it is its beginning. Gah. He reminded them that Allah loves the hearts that come back quickly, not after every bridge has burned and every excuse has been hired, but at the first spark, at the first lie, at the first turn. He encouraged them to build friend circles that serve as gentle alarms, people who ask the right question at the right time. Why are you saying that? Whom does this help? What will remain after you're done? So that a community can keep a soul from drifting the way lighthouses keep ships from sleeping toward rocks. He told them that their professions are lubricants for worship, that a judge can worship by untangling fairly, a merchant by weighing honestly, a teacher by explaining patiently, a laborer by lifting joyfully, and a child by thanking sincerely. And the more they practiced this conversion, the more the distance between sacred and daily disappeared. And when some asked if they would ever be free of stumbling, he smiled with the maturity repentance taught him and answered, "Fall forward, for a stumble spent in turning back becomes a step." Thus the conversation that had begun in a royal hall haunted bakeries and workshops, vineyards and marketplaces, cradles and courtyards, with a soft insistence that made people taller by making them honest. The day came when the hinge of an era finished its turning, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Sulaiman's court, accustomed to motion that felt like meaning, woke to a stillness that was not laziness, but mystery. The prophet king stood as he had often stood, leaning on the staff that had accompanied decisions countless and mercies more, and the work of the Jinn continued under his gaze, building, fetching, measuring, reporting, the world arranged like a sentence that knows its grammar. Then the decree that visits every throne visited his, and he returned to Allah as all servants do. His body remained standing by Allah's will, a message hidden for a time in a posture that looked like life, and the Jinn labored as they had been commanded, unaware that the command would now be measured by a new teacher. The teacher was small and patient, chewing through a staff one grain at a time, reminding creation that the unseen belongs only to Allah, and that no army runs ahead of his knowledge. When the staff finally gave and the body finally fell, a sound traveled through the ranks like the end of a sentence, and they learned the lesson written in Revelation, that if they had known the unseen, they would not have remained in striving, they would have left. The hall filled with the silence that follows truth, and fear arrived carrying old costumes, inviting panic, inviting boast, inviting blame. The Jinn King stepped forward wearing his chains and his memory, and the steadiness he had been practicing met the moment like a door designed for this very wind. "Continue," he said, and the word did not deny grief, it harnessed it. "We served by Allah's permission before, and we serve by Allah's permission now." He ordered the work secured, the vulnerable guarded, the ledgers closed with accuracy rather than haste, and the mourners given room to mourn without letting loss turn into lawlessness. Messengers moved quietly to those who would be most shaken, not with rumors but with prayers and plans, because grief without guidance can become a flood. He gathered the overseers and spoke the covenant aloud so that oaths would not evaporate in the heat of confusion, and he asked Allah to keep their obedience facing the same direction even as the face they loved was veiled. He visited the place where Sulaiman had stood and pressed his forehead to the ground, feeling that famous floor against his skin again, and the day of his begging rose to meet him as if time wanted to brace him. He thanked Allah for having lived under a ruler who taught him to love being ruled by God, and he asked that the lesson become ligament and not merely memory. Outside, news traveled to men and birds and beasts, and each received it in the language Allah had given them. Some cried openly, some worked more carefully, some stood still in a dignity that said everything words could not. The Jinn King faced his own people's tremors, old arrogance trying to stretch awake, saying, "The leash has fallen," and he answered with the sentence that leashes pride without humiliation. The leash was never a leash, it was direction. He reminded them of the bridge they had built while a storm measured their sincerity, of the wells they had sweetened and the roads they had made honest, and he asked the simplest question that cancels chaos: "Will you undo what your hands have finally learned to love?" He convened a council to formalize what had already been breathed for years: service tied to remembrance, power tied to reporting, speed tied to purpose, and they wrote a charter called the Rope, not to replace revelation, but to keep fingers from forgetting how to grip it. They named apprentices whose oath included a promise to be corrected and a promise to correct gently, and they named elders whose honor would now be measured by how many dignities they could protect rather than how many deeds they could dazzle. When voices rose asking for monuments to mark the end of an era, he answered with a better monument: days of maintenance scheduled across the realm, roofs checked, scales inspected, treaties renewed, graves visited, debts forgiven, as if to say that the best statue is a society that does not decay. He sent teams to teach the lesson of the staff to those who bragged about intuiting the unseen, trimming their claims back to the humility revelation requires, and replacing drama with piety. He visited Dawood's psalms and Sulaiman's judgments in the tongues that carried them among his people, not to dazzle gatherers, but to keep his own hands warm with lineage that mattered, lineage of obedience. He watched as a new human stewardship organized itself with grace, and he offered his people speed and strength without bargaining for exemptions, because aligning under justice is easier when you've learned that justice is a shelter. He stood at the edge of Sulaiman's garden when the first official prayer after the news was made, and listened to the sound that tells a city it will survive the sound of Alhamdulillah said through tears. He moved through the days that followed, like a conductor who refuses to hurry the right tempo, slowing the quick until they became careful, steadying the careful until they became strong. And he allowed grief its rightful work, knowing that sorrow sometimes plows a field where gratitude will later grow. He gathered his captains one evening and told them the sentence that would keep them from myth-making. We did not serve a man in place of Allah. We served Allah by serving with a man. And the distinction lowered shoulders and raised standards. He ordered one more task to honor the end of an era, not a festival, but a fast, a day when every Jinn who had labored under Sulaiman would abstain and remember, converting hunger into dua, that their obedience would not end when supervision did. He asked that day to be marked annually, not with stories that grow teeth they never had, but with repairs that honor a legacy by continuing it. As the seasons changed and the new order settled, he walked the halls where he had first bowed and felt, for the first time, that the haunting in the title of their story had found its final shape. Not a terror, but a tenderness that keeps kings on their knees and hands at work. He looked out over a realm that had not collapsed when a single figure fell, and he knew the teaching had landed, because truth survives departures when it has been planted in practice. He whispered toward the place where the staff had once stood, "We will keep building the kinds of things that fall slowly." And then he returned to the lists and the ledgers and the visits and the prayers, which is how eras end well, by turning into habits that belong to God. It echoes because it is true, and truth does not stop speaking when mouths close. The conversation between a king of Jinn who finally begged and a prophet who never needed to, and yet always prayed, keeps walking the corridors of time, tapping quietly at doors that pride has barricaded with stories. It arrives in cities that forgot the names of humility and still remembers theirs, asking them if their bright lights can illuminate a conscience or only a room. It arrives in villages that measure wealth by how many neighbors sleep without locking the second latch, and it smiles because that measure always pleased it. It arrives in palaces where crowns weigh less than egos and asks a single question until the room grows honest: what remains when applause goes home? It arrives in workshops where hands are learning the art of doing a small thing well and says, "This is a throne too, if you remember. Who gave you fingers?" It arrives in courts where verdicts are being baked, reminding each baker that justice burns if you try to serve it half done. It arrives beside beds where the exhausted think they have nothing left to give, and whispers that the smallest dicker can lift a night the way a match lifts a room. It echoes in the chest that once loved being feared and now loves being trusted, telling it to keep choosing the second love, even when the first sends flowers. It haunts because it cleans, and a soul that has seen its own stain is never again satisfied with dirt arranged cleverly. It haunts because it heals, and the scar it leaves is the kind that guides a hand away from the fire it once insisted on touching. It haunts because it simplifies, stripping the theater of power down to the seat, and the seat down to the responsibility, and the responsibility down to a prayer. The Jinn King grew old under that sound without becoming heavy, and he taught his heirs that the echo is not a ghost but a guide, not a threat but a thread that ties every morning to the same promise: serve. He told them to rehearse the conversation out loud when decisions became fog, to say what he had said on the floor of Sulaiman's hall, and then wait until the next thought came from a clean place. He told them that the haunting is a mercy designed to startle you just before you step off a cliff that looked like a stage. He told them that it will follow them into victories and stand behind them at losses, that it will stand beside cradles and attend graves, that it will dress plainly so pride will miss it, and the humble will welcome it like rain. And when voices around him asked for an ending, he refused to give them one, because endings belong to stories that needed to be rescued, not to truths that need to be repeated. He pointed to bridges still carrying carts and said the conversation lives there. He pointed to wells that stopped tasting bitter and said it lives there. He pointed to markets that learned to close an hour earlier because trust saves time and said it lives there. He pointed to the sigh of a widow who can finally sleep and said that is the verse none of your poets should try to improve. He taught that the echo plants standards inside you so quietly that one day you will reach for a lie and your hand will come back empty without knowing why. He taught that the echo will not compete with music, but will tune your ears until music sounds like meaning, or not at all. He taught that the echo will arrive in the middle of an argument with yourself and give you the line you were trying to remember, the line that ends fights before they hire witnesses: I am a servant. And servants are not humiliated by obedience. They are illuminated by it. So the conversation kept walking and would not sit, because sitting would make it local, and it was written to be weather. It crossed deserts that teach patience, and seas that teach balance, and mountains that teach proportion, and found the same hunger everywhere, beings trying to become large in front of each other instead of small in front of Allah. It turned that hunger toward a better meal. It told hearts that size is a trick we play on each other, and steadiness is the truth we owe our Lord. It refused to retire into legend because legends allow you to clap without changing, and this conversation was born allergic to applause. It only accepts implementation. It only accepts doors rehung, debts settled, tempers cooled, hands washed of what they never should have kept. It only accepts leaders who remember the floor as often as they remember the chair. And it warns, politely at first, and then, with the sharpness that love sometimes needs, that the old theater is never fully demolished, it only waits backstage. And the only way to keep it closed is to keep working in the daylight of obedience. The Jinn King would stand at dusk where roofs catch the last fire of the sun, and speak to the air as if reminding it of its own contract. We were given speed to arrive at service first. We were given stealth to protect without demanding credit. We were given strength to lift what gratitude asks for, not what vanity imagines. And the air, which has always been honest, carried that reminder to courtyards where men weighed grain, and to kitchens where women weighed patience, and to fields where boys weighed choices, and to schools where girls weighed words. And the weights began to even out. People learned to use the haunting the way sailors use stars, not to stare at endlessly, but to steer by nightly. They learned to welcome its interruptions like the knock that prevents a theft, the cough that interrupts a lie, the sudden memory that changes a sentence from "I will take" to "I will return." They learn to teach it to their children without spooking them, and to tell them stories in which kings are dignified because they kneel, and warriors are honored because they stop, and judges are praised because they listen, and clever ones are admired because they confess first. They learned to confess small things quickly so they would never have to confess large things publicly, and this skill saved more reputations than any public relations ever could. They learned to schedule gratitude like a necessary appointment, and to keep it even when the day was loud, because gratitude is the hand that holds the echo in place when wind tries to scatter it. They learned to treat mercy like architecture, load-bearing and measured, instead of like decoration you hang for festivals and then box up when guests go home. And the Jinn King, who had once loved storms as toys, came to love roofs as promises and ledgers as hymns and maintenance, as a revolution that never needs a parade. He aged into a clarity that made youth listen, and he told them not to fear the word beg if it points at Allah, because beg written cleanly is another spelling of begin. There is an ending to every breath, but not to this invitation, and that is why it haunts. It stands at the mouth of every morning and asks the same gentle, insistent question: will you be strong enough to be small today? It stands at the edge of every temptation and asks the same saving question: will you turn back quickly while the turn is still a step and not a journey? It stands at the bedside of the sick and becomes patience, at the desk of the scholar and becomes precision, at the stall of the merchant and becomes honesty, at the gate of the ruler and becomes restraint, at the prayer mat of the sinner and becomes a key. It knows the day is coming when kings will discover what their crowns were made of, whether gold that softened into charity or smoke that stained the air, and on that day this conversation will testify without speaking, because your deeds will answer more fluently than your tongue. The Jinn King used to imagine that day as a thunder, and now he imagines it as an unveiling, the moment when hidden intentions appear like ink under the right light, and he asks for one thing more than he asks for life: that his record show the curve of a spine learning to bow faster each year. He asks that his line produce leaders whose first instinct is sajda and whose last instinct is spectacle. He asks that the echo that saved him never leave the walls of his people's hearts, that it keep them from spending strength on what does not last, and from saving face when saving families would be holier. He asks that their speed be a courier of mercy, and their stealth a blanket for the embarrassed, and their brilliance a lantern for the lost. He asks that they be the kind of servants who build things that fall slowly and love things that rise quietly. And when he is finished asking, he returns to the work that keeps asking unnecessary, the work of mending what pride tore, the work of lifting what neglect dropped, the work of teaching what confusion twisted, the work of loving what Allah has made lovable by commanding it. At night, when the city has tucked its noise into drawers, and the sky counts the lamps still burning for study or for sorrow, he walks the roofs where wind keeps counsel, and thanks the Lord who let him kneel while there was time. He thanks the Lord who sent him to a prophet whose dominion taught that dominion is borrowed. He thanks the Lord who taught him to prefer repair to revenge, confession to cleverness, and usefulness to applause. And the echo keeps moving. It moves toward you as surely as mornings do, asking you to make room where your pride stores its furniture, asking you to revise the sentence you were about to say, asking you to choose the smaller word that will make the world larger, asking you to return what your hand forgot to call borrowed, asking you to stand guard at the door where your heart once let cruelty in without ID. It asks for nothing you do not already hold, the next breath and the next decision and the next remembrance, and it promises what no tyrant can, a life that fits you because it faces the one you were shaped to face. If you listen very closely, you will hear what the Jinn King heard on the day he finally knew who he was, that mercy is not a last resort but the first architecture, that obedience is not a leash but a lane, that humility is not a costume for the weak, but the uniform of the wise. And if you answer, even with a whisper, even with a beginning that looks like a begging, the conversation will not embarrass you. It will enroll you. It will draft your gifts into a service that makes quiets wider and nights shorter and mornings truer. It will teach your hands to recognize the weight of what matters and to put down what never did. It will walk with you to the edges where harm likes to gather and give you sentences that disperse it. Forgive me, help me, guide me, accept from me, until your tongue belongs to remembrance the way a river belongs to its bed. And when your story comes to its own stillness, whether standing like a staff or kneeling like a servant, it will leave behind the only haunting that deserves to last, the scent of a life that made it easier for others to do what is right. That scent is the legacy of the conversation between a king who begged well and a prophet who led beautifully. By Allah's permission, may it follow us into every room, and may we be the kind of people who open the door